We've heard different reports from different people involved. Magruder ended up saying, after different versions, that you're the one that ordered the break-in of the Watergate headquarters. And I see you shaking your head, but did you ever order or convey an order to break into the Democratic headquarters at Watergate Hotel?
On your description of my pleading guilty.
Yeah, that came from the New York Times. You can take it up with them.
Right.
But did you ever order?
May I explain before I answer?
Well, you can either answer the question or not.
Be happy to answer your question.
Please.
The question is, did I ever
Did you order or
Yes,
ever convey the order to break into the Democratic headquarters?
No.
On this episode of Just Informed Talk, the circus continues on Capitol Hill as the House Judiciary Committee is meeting today, and we're going to look at highlights to discuss the findings of the Robert Mueller report. Now, what you're going to have to remember is one of their key witnesses that was called by Democrats is an expert in obstruction of justice. So much so that he was disbarred and pled guilty to obstruction of justice with regard to the Watergate break-in. That and much, much more. You guys are going to watch this and enjoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's unusual to have the majority fail to properly give the basis for expertise of one of its own witnesses. But, Mr. Dean, you've got a lot more qualifications in this area than they actually provided in the introduction. Back when New York Times was more accurate, they reported that in your case, John Sirica, the judge, read the formal charges regarding the conspiracy to thwart the investigation, and he read as follows, that you were suborning perjury, giving false statements and concealing evidence in the trial before Judge Sirica last winter of the men arrested in the break-in, offering clemency to the defendants, paying to keep the arrested men silent, asking the Federal Bureau of Investigation for information, attempting to get the CIA to provide money for the payments. In furtherance of the conspiracy, Judge Sirica continued reading. Dean had committed 6 specific overt acts on or about June 27, 72. He directed G. Gordon Liddy to tell Howard Hunt to leave the United States. He asked General Vernon Walters, the Deputy Director of the CIA, whether the CIA could use covert funds to pay the bail and salary of those involved in the Watergate break-in. He had asked the president's former private attorney, Herbert Kalmbach, to raise funds with which to make the payments to the Watergate defendants. He had met with Jeb Stuart Magruder on the campaign staff to help Magruder prepare false, deceptive, and misleading testimony to give the grand jury. He had asked John Caulfield to offer executive clemency to James McCord, another of the original defendants, and he had asked L. Patrick Gray, former acting director of the FBI, for reports of information gained in the investigation break-in. We've heard different reports from different people involved. Magruder ended up saying, after different versions, that you're the one that ordered the break-in of the Watergate headquarters, and I see you shaking your head, but did you ever order or convey an order to break into the Democratic headquarters at Watergate Hotel?
First of all, on your description of my pleading guilty.
Yeah, that came from the New York Times. You can take it up with them.
Right.
But did you ever order?
May I explain before I answer?
Well, you can either answer the question or not.
Be happy to answer your question.
Please.
The question is, did I ever
Did you order or
Yes,
ever convey the order to break into the Democratic headquarters?
No.
All right, thank you. And I know I wasn't.
In fact, I have no evidence that anybody at the White House
Look, I've only got
knew of
5
it.
minutes, and
Okay.
the chairman's not as liberal with us as he is with the Democrats. But for those who are not familiar with the statements here, in his last civil suit, Mr. Dean said, "It could be that I misspoke myself. It's either a misstatement or an incomplete transcription, highly possible. I just misspoke myself. We were trying to paint with the broadest brush we could. I may be not artfully stating here, maybe it was imposing hindsight on events. That is a less than accurate description," talking about what he had said previously. Obviously, it was a self-serving answer, so maybe I can help some of my colleagues if you're tempted to go after questions like that. But
I don't even know what you're referring
it
to.
was the last civil suit you were involved in with Mr. Liddy, where he had begged you to sue him because he called you the biggest liar in the world and things of that nature. And you finally sued him with a bunch of other people and ultimately dismissed the case against him without going to trial as he had asked you to do.
That is not
But
correct.
let me, there are similarities, you're right, with regard to Watergate. And both an administration was seeking to illegally spy on another candidate. And both people were hired to attempt to gather evidence that could be used against a candidate. In Watergate, the committee to re-elect the president hired burglars to break into the DNC headquarters. In Watergate, administration officials tried to find ways to use federal dollars to pay for their criminal spying. In Russiagate, members of the federal government used the Intel, DOJ, and FBI communities to attempt to defeat a presidential candidate, then when that failed, to have him removed from office. In Russiagate, the Clinton campaign and the FBI paid a foreign agent to collude with Russians to produce opposition research that turned out completely false, as the Mueller report indicated, that could be used to commit a fraud upon the FISA court and get multiple warrants to spy on opposition campaign. In Russiagate, it was the Clinton campaign through Fusion GPS in concert with the FBI and possibly intelligence who hired people to do the spying. And what really bothers me, oh, and by the way, Professor White Vance, I have amazing admiration. I used to tell people, if you ever talk to a lawyer that says, I'm going to win at court on this and I'll win the appeal, you run from them because they're either incompetent or they're corrupt, but you have such amazing ability. You know you could win at court on an appeal, so I'm in admiration. But let me tell you, the frauds that were committed on the FISA court in this matter and the abuses of American citizens' Fourth Amendment rights and the fact that people who once cared about this country's Fourth Amendment rights are now more concerned with taking out another party's president, making sure he doesn't get reelected, tells me that we are in a greater danger for our Constitution at this time than we were from the outside of World War II. And I appreciate getting nearly 30 seconds short of what y'all did. Thank you.
Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a December 30th, 2005 essay written by Mr. John Dean entitled George W. Bush as the New Richard Nixon, both wiretapped illegally and impeachably.
Without objection.
Mr. Dean, how many American presidents have you accused of being Richard Nixon?
I actually wrote a book about Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney with the title Worse Than Watergate.
So it's sort of become a cottage. Did you make money on that book?
It was a very successful book,
How much
yes.
money did you make on it?
I'm sorry, I don't have any idea.
More than $1 million?
No.
More than $500,000?
I said I don't have any idea.
How much money do you make from CNN?
I don't really know exactly.
I think I'm going to object to
Wait a second. Mr. Dean has made a cottage industry out of accusing presidents of acting like Richard Nixon. I would like to know how much money he makes based on making these accusations and exploiting them for his own economic benefit. And you're saying that's out of line?
Mr. Gates, I appreciate you were not born at the time this all happened. It's not by choice that I've done a lot of this. It's that I've been dragged into it.
Who forced you to accuse George W. Bush of being Richard Nixon?
Who forced me to? It was right after I had spent 10 years in a lawsuit knocking down false statements about what my role had and hadn't been.
Well, let's speak now to the truth or falsity of statements. Do you have personal knowledge regarding the truth or falsity of a single material fact in the Mueller report?
I think if you recall, the first thing I said, I'm not here as a fact witness.
You're here to provide historical context.
Exactly.
And throughout history, you accuse presidents of acting like Richard Nixon, and you make money off of it, right?
Not all presidents, no.
No, but a few, more than one.
Those who do act like him, I pointed out.
Let me ask you this question. How do Democrats plan to pay for Medicare for all?
I'm sorry?
Well, I figured if we were going to ask you about stuff you don't know about, we'd start with the big stuff. So do you know how they plan to pay for Medicare for all?
Who? The Democrats, or which candidate, or can you be more specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. Do you believe?
Well, actually, Nixon did have a health care plan.
Good. Good. Well, do you believe if we turned the lights off here and maybe lit some candles, got out a Ouija board, we could potentially raise the specter of Richard Nixon?
I doubt that.
Well, it seems to be the objective. You know, here we sit today in this hearing with the ghost of Christmas past because the chairman of the committee has gone to the Speaker of the House and sought permission to open an impeachment inquiry. But she has said no. And so instead of opening the impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump, which is what the chairman wants to do and what I presume a majority of Democrats want to do, we're here reopening the impeachment inquiry potentially into Richard Nixon, sort of playing out our own version of that 70s show. And what I really regret,
It is
Mr. Dean,
striking,
is that
Mr.
you're
Gates.
here as a prop. You are functionally here as a prop because they can't impeach President Trump because 70% of Democrats want something that 60% of Americans don't. So they're in this no-win situation, and you sit before us here with no knowledge of a single fact on the Mueller report, on a hearing entitled Lessons from the Mueller Report.
Mr.
Here's
Gates, can I answer your question, please?
It's not your time, Mr. Dean, it's my time. So here's the deal, right? We have a false accusation against the President of the United States that he was an agent of Russia. My colleagues on the Democratic side made that accusation. And so where do we go from here? Either we look into how the president reacted to a false allegation against him, or we look into why for 22 months, we allowed a false accusation to tear this country apart. Now, to me, it seems like a far more relevant inquiry to figure out why the FISA court was lied to, something that you have spoken a great deal about, Mr. Dean, to find out why the recordings and the transcripts from George Papadopoulos, where he asserted that he wasn't doing any work with Russia, was not brought before the FISA court. None of that. We also would love to know why the FBI turned from an organization that was supposed to be investigating crimes into one that sought to shape public opinion. You had Comey and McCabe and that whole regime of leadership lying and leaking. And the reason they were doing it is because they didn't really think that the job of the FBI was to investigate and bring cases for prosecution. They thought the role of the FBI was to try to shape public opinion. And that's really why we're here. And that's what I really think all Americans ought to have an interest in stopping. And you held these views. You wrote them down. You said that illegal surveillance was one of the worst things that we should fight against as a government. And now here we are continuing to engage in this frivolous exercise of going after the president, despite the fact that there was absolutely no collusion. You guys need to get your act together and figure out if you're going to open an impeachment inquiry or not, because this is a straight-up fiction. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At a memorial event for David Hamburg, Speaker Pelosi and I had a chance to discuss impeachment. Mr. Dean, who wrote that?
I did.
1 month ago, May 11th, 2019, haven't we been too long in not giving Trump a meaningful moniker? Should it be deranged Don, deadbeat Don, demagogue Don? Thoughts, please, comments. Mr. Dean, who wrote that?
I assume that was mine.
It was yours. 19 days ago, May 22nd, 2019, there was this. We are witnessing Trump's massive cover-up of his criminal behavior as POTUS. He's incapable of accomplishing anything. Mr. Dean, you know who wrote that?
I suspect that was me again.
It was you. I want to focus on that last sentence. As POTUS, as President of the United States, he, Donald Trump, is incapable of accomplishing anything. When you made that statement, Mr. Dean, what did you have in mind? You thinking about the 3.2% economic growth rate we had the last quarter? Thinking about the fact we got the lowest unemployment in 50 years? How about the fact the hostages are back from North Korea? Maybe you were thinking about this. When you said the President of the United States was incapable of doing anything, were you thinking about the fact that the embassy is now in Jerusalem? I mean, I think about this one. Every single candidate for as many cycles as I can remember, Republican and Democrat, have promised the American people, you elect me, we're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. And guess what? They get elected and they come up with a million reasons why they can't do what they said they were going to do. But this president didn't. The embassy is now in Jerusalem. So I'm just wondering, what were you thinking about when you said he's incapable of accomplishing anything?
Mr. Jordan, I think that under the parliamentary rules of the House, I'm refrained from addressing a full answer to your question.
You weren't refrained in your tweets and your comments and the things you wrote.
My tweets are not subject to the parliamentary.
They are subject to state of mind and the perspective you bring to this hearing, and I think the American people understand. Let me ask you this then. Did you give advice to Lanny Davis or Michael Cohen prior to Mr. Cohen's testimony to Congress?
No.
Well, you said on Aaron Burnett's show the night before Mr. Cohen testified in front of the Oversight Committee that Michael Cohen should, you said you had talked to Lanny Davis and that Michael Cohen should hold his testimony as long as possible from Republicans. You didn't say that to Mr. Davis? You said it on Aaron Burnett's show the night before Mr. Cohen testified.
I didn't say it directly to Mr. Cohen, was your question.
No, it wasn't. My question was, did you give advice to Lanny Davis or Michael Cohen prior to Mr. Cohen's testimony to Congress?
Yeah, I have known Lanny Davis for almost a couple decades, and we have talked about it. And I did say, as soon as you turn your testimony over, it will be picked apart.
So you instructed Michael Cohen's lawyer to keep information from Republicans to obstruct the committee work that we were doing in the Oversight Committee just a few months ago? You told that to Michael Cohen's lawyer?
I didn't quite phrase it that way, no.
You know what? They took your advice.
I'm sorry?
They took your advice.
Did they?
Yeah.
didn't
Mr.
know
Cohen
that.
kept his testimony from us for as long as possible. But you know what else Mr. Cohen did that day? Lied. Lied 7 times. And this is what I think concerns so many Americans. This is what concerns, I think, so many Americans about the work that's going on in this Congress, this 116th. The first announced witness of the 116th Congress was Michael Cohen, a guy who sits in prison today for lying to Congress. Today, Chairman Nadler brings in front of the Judiciary Committee a guy to talk about obstruction of justice who went to prison in 1974 for obstructing justice.
I did not go to prison.
Okay. You pled guilty to obstruction of justice. I'm glad you got to stay out of prison then, I guess. What bothers me the most, though, is this committee's failure to investigate how the whole Trump-Russia thing started. This is the Judiciary Committee. We're supposed to, how this whole thing began. And I said this a few weeks ago, but I want to remind this committee what the Attorney General of the United States said 8 weeks ago when he testified in front of the Senate. He said 4 important things about the beginnings of the Trump-Russia investigation. He said there was a failure of leadership at the upper echelon of the FBI. His words, not mine. Upper echelon. That's certainly true. Comey, McCabe, Baker, Strzok, Page, they've all been fired, demoted, let go, they're gone. Some of them are under investigation by the Justice Department. He said spying did occur. He said it twice. He said there's a basis for his concern about the spying that took place. And he used 2 terms that, again, I think this committee should find frightening and should be looking into. Unauthorized surveillance and political surveillance. Scary terms. So the good news is, even though this Congress has memorandums of understanding between the key committee chairmen on how they're going to coordinate their attack on the president, even though this Congress' first big witness, first big hearing, Michael Cohen, a guy who sits in prison for lying to Congress, and even though we now have a guy testifying about obstruction of justice who pled guilty to obstruction of justice, we should be looking into the things Bill Barr's looking at. Now, the good news is Mr. Durham's doing that. But this is the part I think that frustrates so many. Mr. Chairman, I would hope the Judiciary Committee and the history this committee has for protecting fundamental liberties would begin to look into those key issues, the whole premise for how this Trump-Russia investigation started in the first place. And I'll finish again with this. Emmett Flood wrote a letter to the Attorney General a few weeks back, made an important point. He said, we would all do well to remember, if they can do it to a president, imagine what they can do to you and me. Imagine what they can do to regular citizens across this great country. That should be what this committee most safeguards and most protects. And instead, we got memorandums of understanding between the chairmen. We got Michael Cohen testifying for 7 hours, getting advice from the witness here on obstructing the committee work and not sharing the information with us in a timely fashion. And now we got John Dean, 45 years ago, pled guilty to obstruction of justice, and now coming in to enlighten the Judiciary Committee on Obstruction of Justice when we could be going right to the start of how this whole thing started. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Before I go to the next witness, I want to point out that this committee has no memorandum of understanding with any other committee with reference to any investigations. So I don't know. I don't know. This committee has no such memorandum of understanding. I'm not aware of any others, but there may be. But this committee has no such memorandum of understanding. And number 2, since the gentleman from Ohio cast aspersions on the witness, I would remind everyone that after Mr.
No, I didn't, Mr. Chairman. I read his statements. I did not cast aspersions. I read his statements.
Very well. Since I believe the gentleman cast aspersions...
You're wrong.
Fine. Since I believe the gentleman cast aspersions on the character and truthfulness of the witness, I would remind everyone that after exhaustive testimony in 1973, when the tapes were revealed, it was revealed that everything that Mr. Dean said was correct and truthful. The next witness...
Mr. Chairman, if I could.